No, no, no. I can never be with a woman on a wheelchair.
In the spring of 2009, Raymond Cole stood at the front door of a house he no longer wanted, holding divorce papers for a woman he no longer loved. A woman sitting in a wheelchair because of an accident she didn't cause. He handed her a pen. She signed, and he walked out without looking back. He thought that was the end of the story. He was wrong. 14 years later, Raymond Cole would lose everything. His business, his home, his reputation, and the person who took it all. He never saw her coming, because he never once considered that the woman he left behind was the most dangerous person he had ever met. Stay with me, because this story does not go where you think it goes. And the twist, there is more than one, will make you question everything you thought you knew about who holds the real power in a marriage. This is the story of Raymond and Margaret Cole, and it ends with a phone call Raymond never expected to make. A phone call where a man who once handed his wife a pen and walked away without looking back found himself on the other end of the line, asking that same woman for mercy. But before we get to that phone call, before we get to the federal investigation and the collapsed empire, and the morning Raymond Cole realized the ground had been shifting underneath him for over a decade, we need to go back, all the way back to where this started, to the people they were before they became the story they became. Because the most important things in this story did not happen in a courtroom or a boardroom. They happened in the quiet years that nobody was watching. And those quiet years are where everything was decided. Before I go any further, I want to lay out 3 questions for you. Hold them close as this story unfolds, because every one of them has an answer, and the answers are not what you expect. First, how does a man who walked away from a disabled woman in 2009, a man who left with more than $1.4 million in assets, while she walked away with $47,000, end up bankrupt, under federal scrutiny, and begging that same woman for a second chance 14 years later? Second, what was Victor Hargrove hiding, and why did a man of that kind of wealth and private power stay completely silent for nearly 2 decades, while his only daughter rebuilt herself from almost nothing? And third, and this is the question that will stay with you the longest, did Margaret plan all of this from the very moment she put pen to paper on those divorce papers? Or did Raymond Cole make so many arrogant and careless decisions for so many years that his own destruction became inevitable the moment he stopped paying attention to her? Keep those questions close. We are going to answer every single one, and we are going to take our time doing it, because this story deserves that. Before we go any deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to the real beginning, not April of 2009. The beginning that explains everything about how 2 people from 2 very different worlds arrived at that bedroom door, that folder, and that pen. Raymond Cole was born in the summer of 1971 in Macon, Georgia, the youngest of 3 boys in a household that was working class, in the most precise and unromantic meaning of that term. The money in the Cole family came from work, and only from work, every week, without buffer, without cushion, without the kind of financial padding that separates a family from the consequences of a single bad month. His father, Earl Cole, worked as an auto mechanic at a shop he did not own, a fact that Raymond would later describe as the central education of his childhood. Not the lack of money itself, though that was real and daily, but the presence of competence without ownership. Earl Cole was genuinely skilled at his work. He was respected across 3 counties in that part of Georgia. He could fix engines that other mechanics gave up on. He had a reputation that was real and earned over 19 years. And he died in 1986, at 44 years old, of a heart attack in the driveway of a shop he had made profitable for someone else for nearly 2 decades. He owned nothing in that building. He left behind a modest life insurance payout, a house with 12 years left on the mortgage, and 3 sons who were going to have to determine the rest on their own. Raymond was 15 years old standing at that graveside, and something shifted in him that day, in a way that never shifted back. He looked at his father's casket and he made a decision, not entirely conscious, but entirely real, that he would never work that hard for something that wasn't his. Whatever he built in this life, he was going to own it. He was going to keep it. No one was going to be able to take it from him by putting him in a driveway one afternoon and closing up the shop. His mother Ruth was the kind of woman whose competence tends to go unnoticed, because it looks like ordinary life. She took in sewing work. She worked part-time at the church office. She maintained the household and held the boys to standards that had no flexibility in them, because flexibility, she explained, was what you earned once you had already done what needed doing. Raymond absorbed this completely. He studied with the discipline of someone who understands that studying is not optional. It is the mechanism, and he understood mechanisms. He worked weekends at a grocery from age 16. He graduated in 1989 with grades good enough for a partial academic scholarship to Georgia State University in Atlanta. He took it without hesitation. He arranged a restaurant job near campus before he arrived, and he came to Atlanta with a plan that was loose in its specifics, but fixed in its direction. He was going to be wealthy. He was going to own things, and he was not going to take long about it. He studied business at Georgia State, with a specific gravitational pull toward real estate that was present from his first semester. He read everything accessible to him, not novels, not general history, but transaction records, market analyses, the biographies of men who had built portfolios from modest origins. He spent hours in the real estate section of the university library with the focused intensity of someone who is not reading for enrichment, but reading for intelligence, trying to understand a system from the outside before he could get inside it. He attended every networking event available to him and cultivated relationships with professors who had industry connections, with older students who had internships at development firms, with anyone who could show him concretely how the machinery of commercial real estate functioned in practice. He was not universally well-liked in those years. There were people who found his ambition performative, people who sensed that Raymond Cole's considerable personal warmth was always in service of a calculation they couldn't quite see. But he was respected, and in Atlanta, in real estate, respected was more valuable than liked. Raymond understood this. He had understood the relative value of things since he was 15. What Raymond built at Georgia State was not just professional knowledge. It was a version of himself, deliberate, constructed, polished by repetition until it felt natural. He understood very early that in the world he was trying to enter, presentation was not vanity, it was infrastructure. The way you carried yourself, the way you spoke in a room, the way you made people feel seen and valued in a conversation that you were simultaneously evaluating for its usefulness. These were not social skills in the casual sense. They were tools, and Raymond Cole built them the way he built everything else, with purpose, with consistency, and with the specific understanding that they were going to be necessary for a very long time. His professors remembered him not as the most technically gifted student in the program, but as the most deliberate. He asked the right questions. He followed up. He took notes not just in class but after conversations, kept a small notebook in his jacket pocket, and wrote down the names and details of every useful connection he made, which is a habit that sounds calculated when described, but which, in the people who maintain it, produces a quality of attention that others experience as genuine care. Raymond Cole was genuinely attentive to people he found useful. The complexity of his character is that this was both real and instrumental at the same time, in proportions that shifted depending on the person and the situation, in ways that even he may not have been able to fully account for. He closed his first solo real estate transaction in the spring of 1998, a small strip mall in Decatur, Georgia, unremarkable in itself, but significant to Raymond in a way that was almost disproportionate to the deal's actual scale. He told Sandra Osi about it years later, not because he was proud of the number, but because of what it felt like to hold the signed documents. He said it was the first time since his father's funeral that he had felt the particular quality of stillness that he associated with being exactly where he was supposed to be. He was not moving towards something. He was standing inside it. The stillness lasted about a week before the hunger returned, and he was already looking at the next deal. But that week, the week of standing inside the thing he had reached for, was something he had been trying to replicate ever since. It is worth noting this because it explains something important about Raymond Cole. He was not purely cynical. He wanted real things. He just could not sustain the experience of having them for very long before they dissolved into the next wanting. That quality would cost him everything, but it was not nothing. It was, at its root, the same hunger that had produced the scholarship and the restaurant job and the real estate library. It had simply never been taught what to do with its own satisfaction, and by the time the cost came due, it was far too late to teach it. He was 21 years old in the spring of 1993 when he walked into a campus debate event specifically to meet a professor who consulted for a commercial development firm, a man Raymond had been cultivating as a professional contact for several months. The professor was moderating. Raymond arrived early, took a seat in the back, and prepared to wait through the event before approaching the man afterward. He did not approach the professor that evening, because in the first 10 minutes of sitting in that room, Raymond Cole encountered Margaret Hargrove, and he forgot why he had come. She was at the podium when he sat down, in the middle of a rebuttal on a point of contract law that Raymond followed only partially. The legal specifics were outside his training, but the way she was arguing it was something he followed completely. She was not loud. She was not performing conviction the way some debaters perform it. She was precise in a way that was genuinely rare. She built her argument the way a skilled craftsman builds something structural, slowly, deliberately, each element placed with intention, each piece interlocking with the next, until the structure was tight enough that the opposing counsel had no visible seam to take hold of. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something genuinely excellent is happening, and everyone present recognizes it before they have named it. Raymond watched her for 20 minutes, without thinking once about the professor he had come to meet. After the event ended, he introduced himself. She shook his hand. She was polite and direct and did not perform interest she did not feel, which Raymond, accustomed to people performing interest for him as a matter of social habit, found immediately and thoroughly arresting. He told a friend that night that he had met someone extraordinary. He meant it. Whether he understood, even then, what he actually meant, whether he was drawn to Margaret herself or to the quality she represented, that particular and rare kind of impressive he had always wanted to be adjacent to, is a question that the story which follows will answer, though not in the way Raymond would have chosen. She was cautious about him in a way that her best friend and eventual attorney, Sandra Osei, who had met Margaret through the pre-law society that same year and who would remain her closest confidant for 30 years, has described as almost clinical. Margaret saw Raymond very clearly from the beginning. She saw the ambition and admired it genuinely. She saw the intelligence and respected it. She saw the charm and was not deceived by it, in the way most people were deceived by it, because Margaret Hargrove understood the functional difference between a person who is warm and a person who deploys warmth with purpose. She saw the hunger underneath everything else, that particular and restless quality of wanting that Raymond carried with him everywhere, that drove him forward and animated his ambition and also, she sensed, would never be fully satisfied by anything or anyone for very long. She told Sandra once, in their second year of knowing Raymond, that he loved her the way a man loves a thing that makes him look good. Sandra told her she was being too hard on him. Margaret nodded, filed the observation, and continued. She was already 20 years old, and she was already keeping a record. Not deliberately, not in the sense of planning anything particular. It was simply how her mind had always worked. Everything went in, nothing was discarded. And that quality, which had no specific purpose in 1993, would turn out to be the most consequential thing about her. Margaret Hargrove had grown up in DeKalb County, raised almost entirely by her mother Dorothy since she was 9 years old. The year Victor Hargrove, Margaret's father, walked out of their lives without a forwarding address or an explanation that Dorothy chose to pass along to his daughter. Dorothy did not speak badly of Victor. She did not speak of him much at all. She redirected every conversation that moved in that direction, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had decided that some questions were not going to be given space in her household. Margaret learned from this, by observation and by necessity, that some gaps in the expected structure of a life simply had to be filled by whatever you built to replace them. She made a decision as a child that was specific and foundational. She would not need anyone who had not chosen to be there. She would construct a life structurally sound enough that no one's absence could compromise it. That decision, made by a 9-year-old girl in a DeKalb County apartment, would one day resonate through a federal courtroom, through 211 pages of forensic accounting, and through the land acquisition records of a company that would hold 43 parcels and $340 million in assets. But in 1993, Margaret Hargrove was 20 years old, and none of that had happened yet. They dated through 1993 and 1994 and maintained the relationship across the transition from college into their respective professional lives. Margaret into Emory Law School, Raymond into his first position at a commercial real estate firm in Atlanta. The geography required effort, the schedule required accommodation, and for a period, the effort was genuinely shared in a way that produced something real between them. Margaret told Sandra that there were stretches of those years when she had been happy in the specific, uncomplicated way she had not been entirely certain she was capable of being. Happy, without a footnote, without the observation filed alongside it. Raymond in those early years had access to something he would gradually lose, a private tenderness he never performed publicly, but that emerged in the quiet spaces between them, a quality of real attention he gave her when she was working through something hard. He was capable of it. She saw it. It was part of why she stayed. She passed the Georgia bar on her first attempt in the summer of 1997. She celebrated largely alone, because Raymond had been at a property walkthrough in Savannah and had forgotten what day the results were being posted. He called when he saw her message. He was warm and genuinely apologetic and full of delayed enthusiasm that was real even if it was late. She thanked him. She filed the observation. Not with anger. She was genuinely not angry about it, which was itself a piece of information. She had simply noted it. He forgot. On the most professionally significant day of the preceding 3 years of her life, it had not been on his calendar. She noted it. She continued. Sandra Osei is worth spending some time with here, because Sandra is one of the most important people in this story, and one of the easiest to underestimate if you are moving through the narrative too quickly. She had known Margaret since they were both 20 years old, sitting in the same pre-law society meetings at Georgia State. 2 young women with different backgrounds and a shared quality of mind that was distinctive enough that each of them recognized it in the other almost immediately. Both were precise. Both were patient in ways that went beyond their years. Both were fundamentally serious about building something real rather than performing the idea of building it. The friendship that developed between them was not the kind built on shared enthusiasms or social proximity. It was built on mutual recognition, the specific recognition that passes between people who have the same operating system and understand, without having to explain it, what that means about how they will approach the world. Sandra would later say that the reason she trusted Margaret's instincts, through every step of what they built together over 30 years, was not loyalty, it was evidence. Every observation Margaret had ever made about a person or a situation that Sandra had initially questioned had eventually been confirmed. The batting average was simply too high to dismiss. Sandra was not uncritical of Margaret. She pushed back when she thought Margaret was wrong, which was rare but real. But she trusted her. And that trust, maintained consistently across 3 decades, was the human foundation on which everything else was built. Sandra shifted her practice to family law and financial litigation in 2008. She maintains to this day that this was her own professional decision, driven by her assessment of where her particular combination of skills, a forensic intelligence for financial structures, combined with the interpersonal precision of someone who understood how families in crisis made decisions, was most usefully applied. That may be entirely true. What is also true is that the specific skills Sandra brought to family law financial litigation were precisely the skills that Margaret's project, which was already forming an outline by 2008, was going to need. Whether the convergence was fortuitous or something Margaret had gently and specifically encouraged, without Sandra realizing the full extent of the encouragement, is the kind of question that tells you a great deal about Margaret Hargrove Cole and probably cannot be answered with confidence by anyone who was not inside her thinking at the time. Sandra has said she doesn't know. Margaret has not been asked publicly. What is certain is that by 2009, when the divorce was finalized, and Margaret arrived in Savannah with $47,000 and the beginning of a plan, the person she needed to execute it was already in the right place, with the right training, and had been her best friend for 19 years. The conditions were set. They married in June of 1999, on a Saturday in a church in Decatur that Margaret's mother had attended for 30 years. The ceremony was full and warm, and attended by a cross-section of both their worlds. Dorothy's church community, the extended Cole family from Macon, the early formation of what would become their professional and social circle in Atlanta. Sandra stood as maid of honor and gave a toast that was warm and specific and careful in the way that only someone who truly knows a person can be careful on their behalf. It said everything about Margaret without saying anything that could be turned against her later. Raymond's older brother Curtis gave a toast that was funny, and then, near the end, slightly unsteady, in a way that some people in the room registered and said nothing about. He said that Raymond had always known exactly what he wanted and exactly how to get it, and he hoped Raymond knew what to do with it once he had it. The room laughed. Raymond laughed. Margaret smiled. If anyone heard the particular note in Curtis's voice when he said it, the edge of someone who has watched something closely for years and is offering a warning in the only socially permissible language available, they kept that to themselves. It was a wedding. You do not say certain things at weddings. But the line settled in the room, and it settled in Margaret's memory. The early years of the marriage were good, in the specific way that the early years of a carefully chosen marriage between two capable, motivated people tend to be good when both are still in the formation phase of what they are individually building, and there is room between their ambitions for genuine partnership. They bought a house in East Atlanta in 2001, a three-bedroom that Raymond had identified 6 months before its neighborhood's appreciation became obvious to the broader market, which was precisely the kind of move that demonstrated to Margaret that his professional instincts were worth respecting. She made junior partner at her law firm in 2002, 3 years ahead of the standard track, which was the kind of achievement that would have drawn sustained acknowledgement from the people around her. Raymond congratulated her. He was also closing a significant transaction in the Chambly corridor that same week, and his congratulations were real but brief. She filed the observation. She continued. They were building, individually and together, and for a period, they were genuinely keeping pace with each other, which is the condition that makes a partnership feel like what a partnership is supposed to feel like. But there is something that happens to certain men when the life they have built begins to feel familiar, not comfortable in the settled sense. Raymond Cole was not a man who disliked comfort. Familiar in the sense of expected, known, already accounted for. Raymond's hunger, the thing that had driven him since 15, since that graveside in Macon, since the scholarship and the restaurant job and the library hours and every deal he had ever closed, was not a hunger capable of being satisfied by arrival. Every achievement dissolved almost the moment it was achieved, replaced nearly immediately by the awareness of the next level, the next version of the life he was supposed to be living. In his professional life, this was largely an asset. It kept him reaching, kept him one move ahead of developers who were satisfied with what they had. In his personal life, it was a slow-moving disaster with a long fuse. Because Margaret, brilliant, accomplished, genuinely extraordinary, was, by 2003, also simply his wife. She was present, she was known, she was the familiar landscape of his daily life. And Raymond Cole, when something stopped being new to him, had a consistent and revealing tendency to stop seeing it. He began working later in 2004. Nothing dramatic at first. An hour here, 2 hours there, the kinds of extensions that any busy developer can justify without difficulty. A client dinner that ran past when he had told Margaret he would be home. A real estate conference in Charlotte, with an extra day that he mentioned after he was already there. These were not, individually, alarming events. Margaret did not raise alarms. She made notes. She tracked the pattern the way she tracked everything. Quietly, specifically, with the precision of someone who understands that a single data point is not a pattern and that the time to act is after the pattern is documented, not while it is forming. What she was observing by the end of 2004 was not any single event, but a direction, a gradual and consistent reorientation of Raymond's attention away from the space they shared and towards something she could not yet see with full clarity, but could absolutely identify by its shape. She tracked it, she waited, she kept going to work. She was fully present in the marriage in every outward sense, because she had decided, without consciously naming the decision, that the correct next move was not yet clear and that she was going to wait until it was. The concrete evidence arrived in the spring of 2005, a credit card statement, a dinner charge at a Buckhead restaurant, $340, a Wednesday evening in April, at a restaurant she knew was a table for two place. Raymond had told her he was meeting a contractor at a property in Marietta that evening. She confirmed through a professional call the following afternoon that the contractor had been in Marietta earlier that day, and that Raymond had left the property before 4 o'clock. The restaurant charge was at 8:15 in the evening. She made a copy of the statement. She started a new folder. She put the folder somewhere Raymond would not encounter it. She said nothing. Not that evening. Not in the days that followed. Not ever, in direct terms, during the marriage. Because Margaret Hargrove Cole understood something that most people in her position do not manage to hold on to in that moment of first confirmation. The moment you confront is the moment you stop gathering. And she was not finished gathering. What she built over the next 2 years was comprehensive and careful. She pulled their joint credit records quarterly. a habit she had established early in the marriage as routine financial hygiene, and which Raymond had long since stopped noticing she maintained. And she tracked every anomaly, unexplained charges, account structures that didn't match what had been discussed, discrepancies between Raymond's reported commission income and his contributions to their shared accounts that suggested money was moving through a channel she couldn't see. She noted the travel patterns. She noted the restaurant charges over time. She noted the texture of a man who was navigating a significant portion of his life in a direction he was not disclosing. There is something I want to say about this period. The period from 2005 to 2007, between the credit card statement and the accident, that gets lost in the forward momentum of the story if we move through it too quickly. Margaret Cole was, during those 2 years, doing something that required an enormous amount of ordinary daily courage that is almost impossible to fully convey. She was going to work every morning and performing competence at the highest level of her profession. She was managing a household. She was maintaining the social and professional relationships that constituted the life she and Raymond had built together. She was being, to the outside world and to Raymond himself, fully present and fully functional and apparently fine. And she was simultaneously carrying a private knowledge about her marriage that would have broken most people's concentration, doing with that knowledge exactly what she had decided to do, documenting it systematically and patiently, day after day, without the release valve of confrontation, without the clarity of acknowledged crisis, in the suspended state of someone who knows what is happening and has decided that the correct response is to wait. That kind of sustained composure is not the absence of feeling. It is a choice made repeatedly, every single morning, to direct the feeling somewhere productive rather than somewhere visible. It is a choice that takes enormous energy to maintain. It is the kind of choice that is almost never recognized as what it is, because the recognition would require knowing what is happening underneath the composure, and Margaret was not telling anyone what was happening underneath the composure. Not even Sandra. She was carrying it alone, and she was continuing. It is also worth saying something about what this period was like for Margaret physically, because we tend to move quickly past the physical reality of a life being lived in real time, and the physical reality matters here. She was a woman in her early 30s doing the full work of a junior partner at an Atlanta law firm, which means early mornings, late evenings, the sustained cognitive and emotional load of managing other people's crises professionally while navigating her own privately. She was healthy. She was capable. She was operating at a level of output that would have been impressive in any person under any circumstances. She had the body she had always had, the body she moved through the world in without thinking much about it, the body that she was going to lose the use of in significant ways in March of 2007 on Peachtree Road. She did not know that was coming. None of this is to say she was living with a premonition or that the accident was anything other than what it was: random, unearned, the specific and devastating kind of bad luck that falls on people who did nothing to invite it. But it matters to hold the image of Margaret Cole in 2005 and 2006. Competent, privately burdened, carrying an enormous amount with extraordinary discipline, because the person she was before the accident is the foundation of the person she became after it. And the person she became after it is the one who spent 14 years building something that Raymond Cole never saw coming. In the fall of 2006, through a connection she cultivated without explanation to anyone around her, she confirmed that Raymond was involved with a woman named Denise Pratt, a marketing professional in Midtown Atlanta. She added the name to the folder. She noted the timeline, and she made a decision that would look, in the fullness of what followed, like either extraordinary strategic discipline or something even more deliberate than strategy. She decided to do nothing about the affair directly, not because she was accepting it, not because she planned to remain in the marriage indefinitely, but because she understood, with the precision of someone who had been building a legal file in her own marriage for over a year, that the affair was not the main event. The main event was what Raymond was going to do about the marriage's financial structure when he eventually decided to end it. That was what she was waiting to see. That was what she was documenting toward. And then, in March of 2007, the car accident happened, and everything shifted in ways that changed the structure of every plan she had been quietly making. She had been in court late on a Thursday evening in March of 2007, a motion hearing that had run past 6 o'clock, the kind of procedural delay that litigators absorb as a matter of professional routine, adjusting their evening and their energy accordingly and moving on. She left the courthouse at 8:30. She called Sandra from the car and they talked for 12 minutes about nothing particular. easy, wandering, the kind of conversation old friends have at the end of a long day, when neither of them has anything specific to communicate, but both of them want the company of the other's voice. Sandra said afterward that Margaret had sounded tired but completely fine, that she had been laughing at something near the end of the call, that it had ended normally, with Margaret saying she was almost home. She never made it home. At an intersection on Peachtree Road, a 23-year-old man operating a truck on a suspended license ran a red light at approximately 40 miles per hour and struck Margaret's car on the driver's side at full speed. The impact spun the car 180 degrees. Margaret lost consciousness at the scene. A man who had been stopped at the light got out of his car and called 911. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. The paramedics noted spinal involvement before they had her in the vehicle. Sandra learned what had happened through a call from the hospital at midnight. She drove there immediately and sat in a waiting room for 3 hours before anyone could tell her anything definitive. Raymond arrived at Grady Memorial Hospital within the hour of being notified. He sat in the waiting room through the early morning hours, and whatever was happening inside him during those hours, fear, guilt, some residual form of love now visible in its almost lost condition, is something only Raymond knows. What the people around him observed was a man who appeared genuinely shaken, who asked the nursing staff for updates with urgency, who did not leave the hospital that first night. Margaret remained unconscious for nearly 3 full days. When she came back to a hospital room, to the particular smell of a place that is keeping you alive, to a husband sitting in a chair beside her bed, and to the gradually clarifying awareness that her body had been changed in a way she was going to have to spend a long time understanding. The spinal cord injury was at the T10 vertebral level. The damage was severe. Recovery of function was possible in a general sense, the specialist told her, but not probable in her specific case. The more likely outcome, stated as gently as the medical language allowed, was that Margaret Hargrove Cole would not walk again. She was 34 years old. She asked the attending physician 2 questions the morning she received the full prognosis. The first, would she be able to work? He said yes, with appropriate accommodations. The second, how soon could she begin intensive rehabilitation? He told her she needed more time to stabilize first. Did she? She said, then let us focus on stabilizing. She did not cry in front of anyone in that hospital room. She did not perform collapse or rage at the situation. She absorbed the information in the way she absorbed everything, filed it, processed it against what she knew and what she needed to know, and began making adjustments to her understanding of what the next period of her life was going to look like. She told Sandra, in their first real substantive conversation, after Margaret was fully conscious and oriented, that she was going to be fine. Sandra said she knew that. Margaret said, no, I mean actually fine. Not fine I am coping. Actually fine. Sandra asked what the difference was. Margaret said she would explain later. It would take her 14 years to explain it fully. But the explanation, when it finally came, was complete. The rehabilitation process was 14 months of the most sustained and demanding physical and psychological work Margaret had done in her life. And the baseline for demanding was not low. This was a woman who had written a law review article during the month she was also studying for the bar exam. She attacked rehabilitation the way she attacked every professional problem, by understanding the mechanism completely before she attempted to execute the task. She asked her physical therapists to explain the physiological purpose of each exercise before she did it. She tracked her progress with the same documentation rigor she applied to case preparation. She identified which techniques were producing measurable functional results and which were producing effort without proportional return. And she communicated her observations to her medical team with a directness that some of them found challenging and all of them eventually found useful. She pushed to the edge of the recommended load consistently and occasionally passed it. Not recklessly, never recklessly, but with a refusal to accept the recommended ceiling as a fixed limit rather than a starting point. She had decided, somewhere in the early days of her recovery, that this was not a situation she was going to be managed through by anyone else's assessment of what was possible. She was going to manage it herself, on her own evaluation, on her own timeline. She was going to recover everything that could be recovered, professionally, intellectually, in terms of her capacity and presence. And she was going to do it in a wheelchair, which was simply the condition of the work now and not an obstacle to it. The distinction mattered to her. She held it very precisely. Raymond was present during the first months of the rehabilitation period, in the visible and functional sense. He visited consistently in the early weeks. He managed the logistics of the household modifications, the accessibility ramp at the front of the house, the bathroom adaptations, the coordination with insurance, the communications with Margaret's law firm about her timeline. He was there and he was doing what a husband in that situation does, and at the surface level it looked like support. But there is a difference between a person who shows up because they love you and a person who shows up because failing to show up is too costly a statement about who they are. Margaret felt this difference. It was not documentable. It was textural, not factual. The way Raymond flinched sometimes when she struggled with a transfer, not with the instinct to help that genuine care produces, in the witnessing of someone you love struggling, but with something closer to discomfort, something that looked from the inside like embarrassment. The way he had stopped initiating physical contact, the way he arrived at the rehabilitation facility already oriented toward the next thing he needed to get to. She observed all of it, she filed it all, and she kept working. There is a specific thing that happens in the dynamic between Raymond and Margaret during the rehabilitation period that I want to name carefully, because it is not unique to Raymond and Margaret, and that is part of what makes it worth examining. Raymond Cole was not a man without decency entirely. He had, as we have established, real qualities: intelligence, ambition, the capacity for genuine warmth in specific contexts. In the first weeks of Margaret's hospitalization, his presence was real and his concern appeared to be real. The problem was not that he was faking it from the beginning. The problem was that his particular psychology, organized around the new, the next, the thing that still offered the promise of the life he was supposed to be living, had no stable mechanism for maintaining presence through something that was not going to resolve quickly and was not going to produce a reward for his patience. Illness and recovery in a spouse require a specific kind of love that is not organized around what you get back. It is organized around what you give forward, into a situation that does not offer immediate return. Raymond Cole had never been required to sustain that kind of love. He had never been tested for it. And it turned out, when the test arrived in the most consequential possible form, that he did not have it in the quantity that the moment required. The specific and devastating cruelty of this is that Margaret knew it. She had always known it, in the way that people who observe clearly know things they cannot prove, and sometimes cannot even fully articulate. She had filed the observation in 1994, when he was 22 years old. She had confirmed it at every subsequent data point. She had known, going into the marriage, that this quality in him was real. She had perhaps believed, in the way that people believe things they want to be true, that the right circumstances and the right partnership might produce a more durable version of the tenderness she had genuinely seen in him in the early years. It had not. The accident did not change Raymond. It revealed him, the way that significant pressure reveals the structural limits of a thing that looked solid at normal load. Margaret saw the revelation clearly. She saw it from a hospital bed, and then from a rehabilitation center, and then from the downstairs bedroom of the house where they had lived together for 8 years. She did not perform devastation about it. She continued. She filed it with everything else she had filed, and she kept working, and she waited for the next move to be his. It was. And when it came, she was ready. By mid-2008, Margaret was home. She was working a modified schedule at the law firm, rebuilding her caseload methodically, navigating the new physical geography of daily life, in a wheelchair with the same systematic attention she brought to every other problem. She returned to full-time status at the firm in October of 2008, earlier than most people around her had predicted, and exactly on the schedule she had set for herself. Through all of this, Raymond was in the house, present in the way that a person is present when they have not yet found the precise mechanism by which to leave, but have already decided that leaving is what they are going to do. Because Raymond had been deciding how to leave since at least early 2008. He opened a private checking account in his name only in February of that year, directing a portion of his commission income through it in a way that was separate from their joint financial life. He had already been structuring his income with some degree of separation for months. Now he began the more deliberate work, the work that would eventually produce 211 pages of forensic accounting and a federal wire fraud investigation. He began drawing down their joint savings account in increments, carefully calibrated to remain below the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. The draws were spaced across time in a way that appeared, in any casual review of the statements, like normal account activity. He was using a technique that has a specific name in financial crimes investigation: structuring. It is a federal crime. Raymond either did not know this or calculated that he would not be caught. He was wrong about the second count. He would not find out for a long time. He established Cole Legacy Holdings LLC in the spring of 2008, a Georgia limited liability company, formed through a transactional attorney he had specifically selected because that attorney had no existing connection to Margaret, to their shared professional world, or to any relationship that might generate disclosure. The family home's deed was transferred into Cole Legacy Holdings. The transfer was executed through a set of documents that were, in the narrowest technical reading, within the legal range of what a property owner can do, but which, in the context of a marriage where the other spouse had not consented and had not been informed, and in the context of divorce proceedings, where the transfer would be obscured rather than disclosed with full specificity, crossed lines that investigators would later document in considerable detail. Raymond restructured his real estate portfolio through the same period. Assets moved into corporate names, valuations arranged to minimize what any divorce proceeding would identify as marital property. He spent the better part of 9 months quietly dismantling the financial architecture of the marriage he was preparing to leave. He was careful. He was deliberate. He believed he was thorough. And on a Tuesday morning in April of 2009, he put on a pressed blue shirt, carried a folder to the downstairs bedroom, and placed it on the wheelchair tray of the woman he had married 10 years before. He told her the marriage had been over for years, that he needed to move forward with his life, that his attorney would be in touch about the financial details. He asked if she had any questions. She looked at him for a moment, not a long moment, but one that contained a great deal, and she asked the one question she needed answered. "Did you drain the accounts?" He told her the finances were complicated and that everything would be addressed through the legal process. He asked again if she had any questions. She looked at the folder. She picked up the pen. She signed her name. He was gone before noon. Sandra called 11 times before Margaret answered. Raymond had left Margaret's phone in the kitchen, which was just far enough from the bedroom that retrieving it required more effort than he had calculated. Margaret would manage quickly. When Sandra finally got through, Margaret's voice was flat in the specific way that a voice goes flat when a person is holding something enormous, very still, so that it does not break anything by moving. She told Sandra she had signed. Sandra asked if she needed anything. She said not tonight. Sandra asked if she was all right. There was a pause, not a long one in duration, but long in what it carried. And then Margaret said, "I have survived worse, and I have time." Sandra stayed on the line for another 20 minutes, saying the things you say when you don't know what else to say to someone you love in a moment like that. When they finally said goodnight, Sandra sat in her car in the parking garage of her Atlanta office building for a while, before she could make herself drive home. Something in Margaret's voice, not the flatness, but what was underneath the flatness. A specific quality of someone who has not broken but has shifted into an entirely different register of functioning, settled in Sandra in a way she could not name that night. She would name it later, much later. When the thing Margaret had said about having time turned out to mean something she had not initially understood, Margaret received $47,000 in the final divorce settlement. The family home was not recoverable. It was held by Cole Legacy Holdings, presented by Raymond's attorney as a pre-divorce corporate asset. The joint savings were not fully recovered. The structuring had been effective enough that the draws could not be reconstructed without the kind of forensic investigation that the family law attorney Margaret had retained under time pressure and limited resources simply did not have the capacity to conduct. Raymond walked out with $1.4 million in real estate, the home, a clean credit profile, and Denise Pratt waiting in a rented midtown condo. Margaret walked out with $47,000, her wheelchair, a box of personal files she had quietly assembled, and the outline of a plan she had not yet fully named even to herself. She left Atlanta. She went to Savannah. She went to a property outside the city she had not seen since she was a child. She went to see a man named Victor Hargrove, a man who was, legally and biologically, her father. A man she had spent 25 years learning not to need. A man who, when Sandra had called him, had picked up on the first ring and had said, "Tell her to come home." Victor Hargrove was 70 years old when Margaret arrived at his estate outside Savannah in the spring of 2009. The property was not ostentatious in the way that significant wealth tends to perform itself. It was simply large and old, and deeply still in the way that land held by the same hands for a long time acquires its own particular quality of permanence. The house was antebellum era, restored with evident care but without display. It sat on 4,000 acres that rolled toward the river, in a way that made the whole of it feel less like private property and more like geography. He was standing on the porch when Sandra's car came up the drive. He walked down the steps toward Margaret's side of the car without any particular ceremony, stopped in front of her, and looked at her for a moment, not with the performed emotion of a long-delayed reunion, but with the steadiness of someone who has been calculating this specific moment for a long time and has decided to be direct about it. He said, "You look like your mother." Margaret said she had been told that. There was a silence between them that held 25 years of absence without fully naming it. Then Victor said, "Come inside," and Margaret went inside. Not because she had forgiven him, not because they had resolved anything, but because she had come here with a purpose, and the purpose was not the conversation about the past. The purpose was what she was going to build next. Victor Hargrove had grown up in Savannah in the 1940s and 1950s, the son of a porter and a domestic worker, in a city that was during those decades rigidly organized around what was and was not possible for a young black man regardless of his intelligence or his ambition or his willingness to work. What he observed from an early age, watching the men in his community who had built something stable, something insulated, something capable of being passed forward, was that the ones who lasted were almost uniformly the ones who were least visible. They built in property and in small commercial ownership, and in networks of private trust that operated outside the formal public economy. They did not make headlines. They did not seek recognition. They held and they waited, and they let the world come to them. Victor absorbed this understanding so completely that it became the structural principle of everything he built. He had made his first land purchase in Savannah in 1972, a parcel that cost very little at the time and appreciated dramatically as the city grew. And he had applied the same logic to every acquisition after it for 40 years. He bought land that was not yet obviously in the path of something, held it without development noise, and waited for the path to arrive. He bought and he held and he accumulated, without fanfare and without visibility. He had done this for 4 decades. By 2009, the result was 4,000 acres outside Savannah, a portfolio of commercial properties across Georgia's coast and interior, investment accounts managed by a firm in Charleston, and a private financial and legal team that had worked with him for 20 years. He was, by any honest financial accounting, an extraordinarily wealthy man. He was known to almost no one outside a very small and deliberate circle. He had left Dorothy and Margaret in 1980 because he had made a choice he would spend every year that followed having complicated and unresolved feelings about. He had decided that what he was building required a kind of singular, undivided focus that the ordinary structure of family life interrupted. He had told himself that Dorothy was strong enough to manage without him, which was true, and that Margaret would be better off without the disruption of his particular way of living, which turned out to be wrong in a way he had not anticipated and could not undo. What he had not calculated when he made the decision was what the absence would actually cost him, not in a sentimental sense, but in the specific sense of the person that Margaret became, and the years of becoming them that he did not witness. The precision, the patience, the specific quality of intelligence and endurance that Margaret had developed, he had not been there for any of it. He had watched it from a distance, through people who knew Dorothy, through the public record of Margaret's career as it developed, through the particular and unglamorous vigilance of guilt. When she arrived at his estate in 2009, he was meeting someone he had failed completely and who had, without any help from him, become more formidable than he had any right to claim credit for. He could not recover the absence. What he could do was be present now and provide the conditions for what came next. He had spent 40 years building those conditions without knowing precisely what they were for. Now he knew. The first evening's conversation lasted 3 hours. What was said in those 3 hours is not something either of them has discussed publicly, and Sandra, who waited in a guest room and came out only when she heard the silence settle, will say only that Margaret emerged looking different than she had going in. Not better or worse. Different. Like someone who has received a confirmation they had been waiting for, and now understands what to do with it. Victor had asked her what she wanted. She said she wanted to practice law again. He said good. And then he asked, "And the other thing?" Margaret looked at her father for a long moment. This man she had spent 25 years not needing, who had been absent for everything that mattered. And she said, I want to make sure Raymond Cole cannot do to anyone else what he did to me. Victor looked at her steadily. He said, "That is going to take time." She said, "I have time." That was the second time in 24 hours she had said that phrase. The first time to Sandra. Both times she meant it slightly differently, but the shape of what she was committing to was becoming clearer with each repetition. She stayed at the Savannah estate for 14 months. She rebuilt her law license and her professional base. She talked extensively with Victor, not sentimentally but with purpose, working to understand what he had built, how it was structured, what its capabilities were, and what could be done with it that went beyond what Victor himself had done with it. And she and Sandra began the work. Sandra Osei had shifted her practice primarily to family law and financial litigation by 2008, which she maintains was her own professional decision driven by her assessment of where her particular skills were most usefully applied. What those skills were, specifically, was a sophisticated understanding of how marital assets could be layered and obscured and, with sufficient documentation and time, recovered. She had a forensic intelligence for financial structures that complemented Margaret's litigation precision in a way that made the two of them, working together, genuinely formidable in a way that neither was alone. Sandra incorporated Hargrove-Meridian Holdings LLC in January of 2011. It was a Georgia limited liability company with clean formation documents, a Savannah address, and no visible connection to anything or anyone larger than itself. Sandra was the registered agent. Victor's financial team provided the initial capital in tranches, structured to match the pattern of normal private investment activity, and raise no automatic flags in any standard business screening. The company's stated purpose was real estate acquisition and management. That was accurate. What the documents did not contain was the strategic framework underlying every acquisition decision, a framework that Margaret and Victor and Sandra had spent over a year developing together, working from market analyses and corridor maps and a specific, private knowledge of where Raymond Cole's professional ambitions were most likely to take him in the coming decade. What Victor contributed to Hargrove-Meridian beyond capital was 40 years of understanding how land is acquired and held and deployed in ways that produce durable, compounding value. He could read a development corridor the way a geologist reads rock strata, not from what was currently visible on the surface, but from what had been accumulating underneath, under pressure, and in what direction that pressure was eventually going to find release. He had watched Atlanta grow from a city into a sprawling metropolitan region for 4 decades, and he had mapped, in his private analysis, the corridors that were going to define the next chapter of that growth. One corridor in particular, a stretch of land north of Atlanta that in 2010 had the look of a transitional zone, not yet developed, not yet on the major players' radar, sitting directly in the path of a demographic and commercial expansion that was as close to inevitable as anything in real estate ever gets, was one that Victor had been tracking for years. Margaret and Sandra began acquiring in it, slowly, deliberately, without any visible pattern that would attract attention. A parcel here, several months later another one, then a pause, then another. 11 of the parcels they would eventually hold, acquired between 2011 and 2018, were in or directly adjacent to the development corridors that Raymond Cole, based on his established professional habits and his known scale of ambition, was most likely to target within the following 10 years. Margaret knew Raymond's instincts because she had spent a decade watching them operate from the inside of his life. She bought accordingly. She was not in a hurry. The parcels would sit, they would appreciate, and when Raymond eventually tried to build what he was inevitably going to try to build, something large enough to be his legacy, requiring land he did not own, Hargrove-Meridian would already be there, waiting, holding, already in position before Raymond had finished deciding what he wanted. The mechanics of what Hargrove-Meridian was doing in those years, and by mechanics I mean the daily, unglamorous, procedural reality of accumulating 43 parcels of land over a decade without attracting attention, deserve more attention than they usually get in the telling of this story, because the mechanics are where the actual discipline lived. Every acquisition required title work, environmental review, survey confirmation, closing coordination, and post-acquisition management. Every parcel, once acquired, required ongoing property tax management, boundary maintenance, monitoring for adverse possession risks, and coordination with local municipal authorities on zoning and land use matters. The portfolio, as it grew, required increasingly sophisticated internal tracking, Which parcels were adjacent to which infrastructure plans? Which municipal development approvals were being filed near the corridor holdings? Which changes in zoning law might affect the strategic value of specific properties? This was not passive holding. This was active, attentive stewardship of a portfolio that was being managed toward a specific long-term outcome. It required professional management. Margaret provided it herself in the early years and built a small team around it as the portfolio grew. A property management director, a financial controller, and an administrative coordinator, operating under Sandra's external legal oversight. The organization was lean by design. Every additional person was a potential disclosure of information that Margaret needed to remain undisclosed. Lean, rigorous, and quiet. That was the standard. That was maintained for 12 years without a single significant leak. And that discipline, boring, procedural, daily discipline, was what made the strategy survivable across a decade of waiting for the right moment. Victor's contribution to this daily management should not be underestimated either. He was 80 years old and in declining health by the time Cole Pinnacle was announced. But his mind was clear and his operational knowledge was irreplaceable. He had been managing private land portfolios for 40 years. He knew what to watch for: the municipal permit filings that signaled development interest moving into a corridor, the infrastructure investment announcements that preceded commercial expansion, the patterns in zoning board activity that preceded major rezoning. He reviewed Hargrove-Meridian's acquisition decisions with Margaret, providing the kind of seasoned calibration that cannot be learned from market data alone, but only from decades of watching how land value actually accumulates in practice. There is a conversation they had in the fall of 2020, documented in Sandra's notes from a call she was on, that I think captures the quality of what Victor brought to the strategy in those final years, before his health made sustained engagement difficult. Raymond had just announced Cole Pinnacle publicly. The architectural renderings were available online. Margaret had reviewed them. She called Victor. She described the layout. She asked him, "Is the 14-acre parcel as critical as I calculated?" Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, more critical. "If they can't get that parcel, the hotel component loses its sight lines, and the residential component loses its separation from the commercial noise. The whole configuration depends on it." Margaret said, "Then we hold." Victor said, "Yes." And then he said, "How much longer do you think we have?" He was not asking about the land. Margaret understood what he was asking. She said, "Long enough." She was right. He died 14 months later, and the outcome he had spent 8 years helping to build was already secured before he left. Meanwhile, Raymond Cole was building, or believed he was. Cole Development Group launched formally in 2010, the same year he married Denise Pratt in a ceremony that was smaller than his first wedding and attended by fewer people who had known him for a long time. The company grew through the mid-2010s, riding Atlanta's commercial real estate expansion with the kind of steady deal-making that earns you quotations in industry publications without quite making you famous. He was comfortable. He was respected in his professional community. He had the life he had been planning since he was 15 years old in Macon, and he had, completely and comprehensively and at a level he could not have articulated, because it required him to acknowledge something he had decided not to think about, forgotten about Margaret. Not in the surface sense. She came up occasionally, in passing, when mutual acquaintances asked. He would say she had moved away, and he wished her well, and he would change the subject quickly. But he had forgotten her in the more dangerous sense. He had stopped accounting for her as a factor. She was the past. She was the woman he had left with $47,000 and a wheelchair, somewhere he didn't know, doing something he didn't care about. He had decided she was finished, and that decision was the single most expensive error of judgment he ever made. The first indication that something in his professional landscape was not entirely within his control arrived in October of 2014. Raymond had been tracking a development corridor north of Atlanta and had identified a 6-acre parcel as a strategic acquisition target. His team submitted a competitive purchase offer through standard commercial channels. The offer was rejected before his broker could even schedule a follow-up call, not with a counteroffer, not with a request for improved terms, simply with a notification that the property was not available. The seller was identified as Meridian Land Partners, LLC, a Savannah-registered Georgia entity with no public profile. Raymond's team ran a standard background check, found nothing notable, reported back that the buyer appeared to be a private investor with a long-hold strategy. Raymond was frustrated. He moved on. He had other deals. He did not investigate further. He did not trace the registered agent. He did not look for the name behind the name. Margaret was gone. The chapter was closed. He moved on. It happened again in March of 2016. A 9-acre parcel in the same corridor, which Raymond had been monitoring in market data and had identified as his next logical acquisition in that area. He submitted his offer through a different broker this time, reasoning that speed in the process had been the problem. The parcel sold 2 days before his offer was formally submitted, again to a Georgia LLC, again with a Savannah connection. Raymond asked his team to look into it more carefully. His team did a surface-level review and reported back that the buyer appeared to be a patient private investor with no visible development intentions. They did not trace the registered agent chain back to Sandra Osei's name. They did not find the Hargrove connection. They confirmed there was nothing to worry about, which was what Raymond had, in the unspoken but unmistakable way of a confident man, asked them to do. He moved on. He was Raymond Cole. He was building. The past was behind him. The future was in front of him. He was not looking back. And the person behind him was counting on that. Precisely and completely counting on that. Raymond's business partner, Elaine Moss, had, during this period, made observations that, in retrospect, should have prompted more investigation than they did. Elaine was a careful and experienced commercial real estate professional who had joined Cole Development Group in 2013 after a decade at a larger Atlanta firm. She had a strong eye for market anomalies, patterns in land ownership or transaction timing that did not conform to what normal market dynamics would produce. On 2 separate occasions, in 2015 and again in 2017, she raised with Raymond the observation that the North Atlanta corridor they were tracking had a land ownership pattern that she could not fully explain from market fundamentals alone. Specifically, certain parcels in the corridor were being held without any visible development activity, by entities with no public development profile in a configuration that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. She told Raymond she thought someone was positioning strategically in the corridor in a way that was not visible on the surface of the market. Raymond told her she was overanalyzing a private investor's hold strategy. He said this with the particular confidence of a man who is certain he understands his environment and finds excessive caution in others mildly irritating. Elaine noted his response. She did not press the point further. She moved on. She would think about those 2 conversations very differently after December of 2022, when the picture became clear. She said later that the thing that stayed with her was not that she had been right. She had been right. What stayed with her was that she had raised the concern and then dropped it because Raymond was certain. She had allowed his certainty to override her own evidence-based concern. She said she had done this not because she trusted his judgment more than her own in general, but because in those specific conversations about that specific corridor, his certainty had the quality of someone who had already decided the question was closed. She had not understood, at the time, why the question had felt so completely closed to him. After December 2022, she understood. There is a thing I want to name here that is easy to miss when the story is moving fast. What Margaret and Sandra and Victor were doing through all those years was not dramatic. It was not the kind of activity that produces tension or visible momentum or anything that would have registered on anyone's radar as significant. It was quiet acquisition, steady documentation, patient positioning, the kind of work that looks, to the outside world, like nothing, because it is designed to look like nothing. Margaret was living her life in Savannah. She was practicing law. She was rebuilding a relationship with her father in the complicated and imperfect way that adult children and absent parents rebuild things when both parties are trying and neither party fully knows how. She was working. She was present in the daily sense. She was not consumed by Raymond Cole or by what was coming. She had made her decision and she was executing it, and the execution looked from the outside like ordinary life, because she had made it look that way on purpose. She was invisible, and invisible people, as we are about to see, can do things that visible people cannot. They can be in a place before anyone thinks to look there. They can hold a piece of land for 10 years without anyone connecting it to anything. They can wait, and then, when the moment arrives, they can move once. And it can be enough. There is something almost instructive about watching a confident man build toward a catastrophe he cannot see coming. By 2019, Raymond Cole was 58 years old, with a solid mid-tier development reputation, a business partnership with Elaine Moss that had been productive for 9 years, and a vision for what the next chapter of his career was supposed to look like. He called the project Cole Pinnacle. It was a mixed-use development complex. Residential units, Class A office space, commercial retail, a hotel component, planned for the North Atlanta growth corridor that had been accumulating commercial momentum for years, and that Raymond, with his genuine instinct for where value was going to move, had correctly identified as the most significant development opportunity of his career. He spent 2 years in the planning phase before making any public announcement. He lined up investors. He retained a highly regarded architectural firm. He commissioned site analyses. He had everything prepared before he said a word publicly. He announced Cole Pinnacle in late 2019 with the confidence of a man who had done his homework. He had done most of his homework. He had not done the one piece that mattered most. He had not traced, systematically and completely, the ownership of every significant parcel in his target corridor. His team had been tasked with identifying parcels that were available for acquisition. They had not been asked to comprehensively map the ownership of parcels that appeared, based on surface-level market data, to simply be passively held by private investors. The 14-acre parcel that was geometrically and commercially essential to the Cole Pinnacle layout, the parcel without which the project's configuration did not work, the parcel that investors needed to see in the plan for the numbers to justify their participation, was owned by Hargrove-Meridian Holdings, LLC. Raymond's team discovered this when they initiated the formal acquisition process in early 2020. They ran an ownership search, found the LLC, noted the Savannah registered agent, and submitted a formal inquiry. Sandra Osei's office responded on behalf of Hargrove-Meridian. The property was not available. Raymond increased his offer significantly, to a price approximately 20% above the assessed market value, a premium that in any normal commercial transaction would have moved the conversation forward. Sandra's office replied with a single sentence: "Our client has no interest in selling at this time or at any foreseeable time." Raymond's attorney sent a more formal and more persuasive letter. Same response. Raymond brought his architectural team back in and asked them to find a way to restructure the project that did not depend on the 14 acres. They worked on it for 4 months. They could not make an alternative configuration viable. The parcel was where it was. The project was what it was. And the owner was not selling. Cole Pinnacle was formally discontinued in the fall of 2022. The public statement from Cole Development Group cited land acquisition challenges. It did not convey that Raymond had committed approximately $6.2 million in pre-development costs, architectural fees, environmental studies, engineering assessments, investor relations expenses, legal fees, and a substantial personal financial commitment he had not fully disclosed to his partners. When his investors withdrew, and they withdrew quickly, as investors in failed projects always do, because the first priority of a person who has committed capital to a failed project is to stop being associated with the failure, Raymond was holding those costs against assets that could not absorb them. Elaine Moss dissolved her partnership with Cole Development Group in November of 2022. She said publicly that the decision reflected irreconcilable differences in risk management philosophy. In private, she told people she had watched the trajectory clearly enough to understand that she needed to exit before the ground finished falling. She had seen what was coming. She got out. The ground was going to fall further. Raymond's attorneys, searching for any legal strategy around the Hargrove-Meridian situation, eminent domain angles, unfair competition arguments, anything that might provide leverage, had finally begun tracing the corporate ownership chain with the systematic thoroughness they should have applied much earlier. In December of 2022, a paralegal in the firm found Victor Hargrove's name in a set of trust-related public filings associated with Hargrove-Meridian. 2 days later, she found Margaret's name in the same documents. Victor's estate planning filings had listed Margaret Hargrove Cole as a named beneficiary in a 2018 amendment. The supervising attorney brought both findings to Raymond in a conference room meeting. Raymond looked at the printed page. He looked at the name Hargrove-Meridian. He looked at Sandra Osei as registered agent. He looked at Margaret Hargrove Cole. And 14 years of having decided that Margaret was behind him, that she was the past, that the chapter was closed. 14 years of that certainty collapsed into a single moment of understanding that he would later describe to his bankruptcy attorney as the worst meeting of his professional life. He called Sandra from the conference room. She answered in a voice that was completely and professionally neutral in a way that, in retrospect, should have told him something. He said he wanted to speak to Margaret. She said she would pass that along. He said to tell her this was business, not personal. Sandra said she would pass that along as well. He said there were other people affected, investors, employees, people who had nothing to do with his history with Margaret. Sandra thanked him and ended the call. 3 days later, Margaret took the call. It was on speaker. Sandra was in the room. Raymond made his case. The land position was punitive. There were innocent parties affected. He was willing to negotiate any terms. He was sorry for the ways things had ended between them. Margaret let him finish. She said, "Raymond, I am not doing anything to you. I own land. I have been offered money for it and I have declined. That is not personal. That is property rights." He started to say something else. She said, "I hope you find a way forward." She ended the call. Sandra looked at her across the desk. Margaret said, "Now we finish it." There is something that needs to be explained here, because the timing of what happened next may seem sudden if you don't know the background. The formal investigation into Raymond Cole had not started in 2022 or 2023. It had been running, quietly and without Raymond's knowledge, since 2016. In March of that year, the Georgia Secretary of State's office had received an anonymous written complaint alleging that Raymond Cole had engaged in deliberate marital asset concealment in connection with the 2009 Cole divorce proceedings. The complaint was specific in ways that anonymous tips almost never are. It named account numbers. It named precise dates. It named Cole Legacy Holdings and provided the filing date and the name of the transactional attorney Raymond had used. It reconstructed the joint savings account drawdown schedule with a precision that suggested direct access to the underlying bank records, or an independent forensic reconstruction of equivalent rigor. It was not a grievance, it was a case file. The complaint was forwarded to the state attorney's office and assigned for preliminary review to a financial crimes investigator named Carl Weston. Weston had 11 years of experience in this area. He had seen asset concealment cases before. They were statistically common, chronically under-prosecuted because victims typically lacked the resources and documentation to pursue them effectively. What made the Cole file different from his first read of it was the quality of the preparation. The tip filer had not guessed. They had documented. They had done the kind of careful, sustained forensic reconstruction of a financial picture that Weston typically associated with professional investigators, not aggrieved former spouses. He began pulling the public record on Raymond Cole. He traced the Cole Legacy Holdings formation. He found the deed transfer. He found the discrepancy between the portfolio value Raymond had disclosed in the divorce proceedings and the value that Weston's independent reconstruction from market and transaction data was producing. He filed a preliminary report. A formal multi-agency review was opened. By 2019, the investigation had generated a federal referral for potential wire fraud because portions of the account structuring had crossed state lines and involved federally regulated financial institutions. Raymond Cole was announcing Cole Pinnacle at a presentation to investors, while the federal investigation was accumulating in a file that had his name on it. He had no idea. He was at a podium. The investigation was at his file. Both things were happening simultaneously in the same city. I want to spend a moment with Carl Weston here, because Carl Weston is another person in this story who tends to get reduced to a function, the investigator, when what he actually represents is something more important than that. Weston had spent 11 years doing financial crimes work at a time when marital asset concealment was one of the most consistently under-prosecuted categories of financial fraud in the Georgia legal system. Not because it was rare, it was common, statistically among the most common forms of fraud he encountered, but because the victims were almost always in the worst possible position to pursue accountability, emotionally devastated, financially depleted by the very conduct being investigated, often without the resources to retain the forensic expertise the cases required, and facing a legal timeline that frequently outlasted their capacity to sustain the fight. The result was that most asset concealment cases, even ones with strong underlying evidence, died quietly in the preliminary phase because nobody had the combination of documentation and stamina to carry them through. Weston had seen this pattern so many times that he had developed what he described to colleagues as a resignation reflex. The instinct, on receiving a new tip, to begin already calculating how far it would go before stalling. The Cole file broke that reflex from his first read of it. The documentation was too good. The preparation was too thorough. Whoever had put the tip together had not just identified the wrongdoing. They had reconstructed the evidentiary foundation with a rigor that Weston associated with professional investigators, not aggrieved former spouses working from memory and frustration. He told a colleague early in the review that whoever had submitted the tip either had direct access to the underlying bank records or had done an independent forensic reconstruction of equivalent quality. He said it meant the tip would hold, and it did. 7 years later, 211 pages later, a federal wire fraud referral later, it held. Because the person who had built it to hold. That was never in any doubt. January of 2023. The state attorney's office filed formal civil and criminal charges against Raymond Cole. Civil, marital asset concealment and fraudulent transfer of marital property. Criminal, through the federal track, wire fraud connected to the interstate structuring of the account transfers. The charges were accompanied by a forensic accounting document of 211 pages that reconstructed every significant financial transaction Raymond had made in the 12 months prior to the April 2009 divorce filing. Every joint savings drawdown, the Cole Legacy Holdings deed transfer, the portfolio restructuring. Every transaction was documented, time-stamped, and explained in language that left no interpretive gap. The document had been prepared by a forensic accounting firm in Savannah that had access to supporting materials the state investigators' own resources had not been sufficient to compile fully and independently. Carl Weston, reviewing the complete submission, noted quietly to a colleague that whoever had provided the additional documentation had effectively completed investigative work that would have taken his office additional years to compile on their own. He said it once. He did not put it in any official record, but he said it, and the people who heard him knew what it meant. Raymond's attorney publicly described the charges as politically motivated and factually unfounded. Raymond gave a statement outside the courthouse on the day of the arraignment, calling the proceedings an act of personal revenge. The Atlanta Business Chronicle story ran 48 hours after the formal announcement. Cole development under scrutiny. Questions raised over 2009 divorce proceedings. The commercial real estate community in Atlanta is not large, and it moves information between the people whose opinions matter faster than any news outlet. Within a week of the story running, 3 investors who had been in preliminary conversation with Raymond about a possible salvage structure for Cole Development Group had withdrawn from those conversations without formally explaining why. Raymond's phone, which had always rung steadily, went quiet in a way that was specific and total and that he felt immediately. The civil verdict came in June of 2023. Raymond Cole was ordered to pay Margaret Cole restitution of $2,100,000. The figure reflected the adjusted value, accounting for inflation, accrued interest across 14 years, and compensatory damages authorized under Georgia marital property law of the assets that had been fraudulently concealed and transferred in connection with the 2009 divorce. His real estate license was suspended pending resolution of the criminal proceedings. The verdict was read in a Fulton County courtroom on a Tuesday morning. Raymond was present. He stood outside afterward and told the reporters who had gathered that this was about a bitter woman who could not move on. A reporter at the back of the crowd asked him to specifically address the forensic accounting document, 211 pages, entered into the public record, reconstructing every transaction. Raymond said his attorney would address the specifics in court. He had no other answer for the specifics. He got into the car that was waiting. He did not look back at the building. Denise Cole filed for divorce 3 weeks after the civil verdict. She cited irreconcilable differences. Her attorney negotiated a settlement that gave her the Midtown condo, 2 vehicles, and a substantial portion of Raymond's remaining personal accounts. Raymond's remaining personal accounts, after the restitution order and 2 years of criminal and civil legal defense costs, were not substantial. He accepted the settlement terms without contest. He had no viable position from which to contest them, and enough residual self-awareness to understand that contesting would cost more than accepting. Denise moved out. Raymond moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of Atlanta that had no connection to the professional or social world he had constructed over 20 years. He was 52 years old. There is something worth observing about Denise's departure that I do not want to skip over, because it is part of the architecture of what this story is actually about. Denise had been watching the trajectory of Cole Development Group for the better part of 2 years before the formal collapse. She had her own professional network, her own sources of information about what was happening in Raymond's business, and she had been making her own quiet preparations for a period of time that her filing timeline suggests was at least 18 months before the civil verdict. She had consulted a family law attorney in early 2022. She had been paying attention while Raymond was performing confidence. She had, in other words, done something that rhymed structurally with what Margaret had done. Paid careful attention to a man who had stopped paying attention to her, made her plans on her own timeline, and executed when she was ready. The scales were enormously different, but the structure was almost identical. Raymond Cole had managed, across 2 marriages, to be the person who stopped paying attention twice. In different ways and at different levels, both women were counting on exactly that. Cole Development Group was formally dissolved in August of 2023. Raymond filed for personal Chapter 7 bankruptcy the same month. His petition listed total debts of $4,300,000 and total assets of $180,000. The man who had structured a $1.4 million real estate portfolio to leave his disabled wife with $47,000 was, 14 years later, personally insolvent. The amount Margaret had left with in 2009 was more than Raymond had now in 2023. I want to let that be what it is, without adding anything to it. Some things explain themselves. February of 2023. Victor Hargrove died at his estate outside Savannah, at the age of 81. He died in his sleep, quietly, in the house he had built over 4 decades of deliberate, private accumulation. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. His passing went largely unannounced in any major outlet. Victor had spent his entire life engineering his absence from public attention, and his death maintained that same quality of privacy that had characterized everything about him. A small notice appeared in a Savannah legal publication. His estate's financial and legal team was notified. Margaret was at the house when it happened. She had been there for several weeks, after Victor's health had declined in January, and it had become clear that the end was close. He died in his own bed, in his own house, on land he had held for 40 years. He was, in the imperfect and complicated accounting of what he had been to the people around him, a man who had failed significantly in some directions and built something extraordinary in others, which is a more honest description of most lives than we usually allow. Victor's estate went entirely to Margaret Hargrove Cole. The will was precise and unambiguous, drafted and refined over many years by a team of estate planning attorneys, who understood that precision in a document of this kind is not a luxury but a structural requirement. There were no competing claims, no ambiguity in the language, no gap through which litigation could enter. Margaret inherited the Savannah estate and the 4,000 surrounding acres, the commercial properties in Savannah, Augusta, and Macon, the Hargrove-Meridian portfolio with all its holdings, the investment accounts, and the private trusts that Victor had been building since the 1970s. The combined estimated value, as assessed in the probate proceeding, was $340 million. The woman Raymond Cole had handed a pen to in a wheelchair in April of 2009, the woman he had left with $47,000 and had decided was finished, was the past, was behind him and no longer a factor in anything, was now, in the spring of 2023, one of the most significant private landowners in the state of Georgia and among the most substantial private wealth holders in the Southeast. She did not hold a press conference. She did not issue a statement. She did not post anything on social media because she did not have a public social media presence of any kind. She called Sandra. Sandra asked what she wanted to do. Margaret said, "I want to finish it." The formal charges had already been filed by the time the probate proceeding was underway. Victor's death in February and the January filing of charges were separate events proceeding on their own tracks, which is important to understand. The charges were not a response to the inheritance, and the inheritance was not a response to the charges. Both things had been in motion for a long time, and they were arriving now because they had been built to arrive now, at this specific convergence of timing and circumstance. The forensic accounting document, 211 pages, had been prepared in Savannah with access to materials that the state investigators' own resources had not been able to fully compile independently. The materials had been gathered over years. They had been prepared with professional rigor. They had been submitted at the precise moment when the legal window was most favorable, and when Raymond's own financial and professional position had deteriorated far enough that his capacity to mount an effective defense was structurally compromised. The timing was not accidental. The timing was the final expression of the patience that had governed everything from the beginning. The civil verdict came in June of 2023, $2,100,000 in restitution. Raymond's real estate license suspended. The criminal case, proceeding in federal court on the wire fraud charges, would take longer and would result in early 2024 in a plea agreement. No prison time, a 5-year probationary period, and a financial penalty that was largely procedural given Raymond's bankruptcy filing. He avoided prison, but his professional life, his financial position, the reputation he had spent 20 years constructing in Atlanta's commercial real estate community, these were gone, not damaged, gone. The kind of gone that does not recover in the ordinary course of things. Margaret made no public statement about the civil verdict. She made no statement about the plea agreement. She made no public statement about any of it. She did not need to. The record was the statement. The 211 pages of forensic accounting, entered into the public record of a Fulton County court, were the statement. The restitution figure was the statement. Everything she had built from $47,000 and a wheelchair and the outline of a plan she had not yet fully named to herself in April of 2009, all of it was now part of the official, permanent, publicly accessible record of what had happened. The truth had been entered. That was what she had been building toward, not the money, not Raymond's collapse, though that followed from the truth. The record. The permanent, provable, documented record of what had actually occurred. For a woman with a litigator's mind, that was the only outcome that counted. In October of 2023, a quiet communication arrived at Sandra Osei's office through a professional intermediary. It was not a formal legal document. It was an inquiry, delicate in its language, careful in its construction, from Raymond Cole's personal attorney, asking whether there was any role available within the Hargrove-Meridian organization for a person with Raymond's background in commercial real estate development and property management. The communication acknowledged his situation. It acknowledged the history. It did not attempt to minimize either. It used the word asking, specifically and more than once, which was a word that Raymond Cole had not used in relation to Margaret in any form for 14 years. Sandra brought this to Margaret. There was a silence on the phone line that Sandra has described as one of the longest silences she has ever experienced in 30 years of friendship and professional collaboration. A silence that was not empty but full, containing a great deal of weight and a great deal of decision. Then Margaret said, "I will need to think about it." She thought about it for 48 hours. She did not consult Sandra during those 48 hours, which was unusual. She did not call anyone. She thought. And then she called Sandra back on a Thursday morning and said yes. She offered Raymond Cole a position as property management coordinator for 2 of Hargrove-Meridian's commercial properties in the Atlanta area. The role was salaried, not equity-based. He would report to a property management director who had been with the company for 6 years. It was a mid-level position that, in any context other than this one, a man with Raymond's background and 20 years of development experience would have considered well beneath him. Sandra asked why. Not to challenge the decision, Sandra had learned long ago that Margaret's decisions were worth trusting, even before the full reasoning was visible. She asked because she genuinely wanted to understand. And Margaret told her. She said, "Because I was never trying to destroy him. Destroying him does not accomplish what I set out to accomplish." She said, "I set out to make sure he could not do to someone else what he did to me. Having him inside a structure he can see clearly, a structure built by the resources and the patience and the years he dismissed as irrelevant, that accomplishes it." She paused, and then she said something that Sandra has shared quietly with the people who needed to understand what Margaret Cole is actually made of. She said, "I want him to understand, from the inside, what it feels like to work inside something that someone else built, with someone else's name on the door, on someone else's terms, doing work that someone else defines, not to humiliate him, so that he comprehends it, so that every morning when he sits at that desk, he has the opportunity to understand what he cost, to himself, to me, to anyone who was depending on the integrity he didn't have. That is not revenge. Revenge is fast, and it is for me. This is a lesson that lasts, and it is for him." Raymond Cole accepted the position. He began work at Hargrove-Meridian Holdings in November of 2023. He shows up on time. He does the work assigned to him. He is, by the accounts of the people who have encountered him in that professional context, quiet and correct in his conduct, present without the performed confidence that used to define his presence in any room he entered. He is a man who has arrived at the end of a road that he built himself, through decades of decisions that he made deliberately and without sufficient accounting for what they would eventually cost, and he is continuing. What he experiences when he sits at that desk, in a company built by the woman he handed a pen to and walked away from, that is interior. It is not visible from the outside. Whether it constitutes anything like genuine understanding or accountability is not something that any external account can confirm. What is external and confirmed is this. Raymond Cole works for Margaret Cole. Every single day. He did not see it coming. He could not have seen it coming, because he had stopped looking at her in April of 2009, and she had been building the whole time he was not looking. Margaret Hargrove Cole continues to operate Hargrove-Meridian from the Savannah estate. She is rarely seen in the Atlanta offices. She does not need to be. She built an organization that does not depend on her daily presence, which is, when you sit with it for a moment, exactly the kind of structure she has always built in every area of her life. One that is sound enough to function without her having to hold it up by being constantly visible. Sandra Osei maintains her Atlanta practice and continues as Hargrove-Meridian's primary outside legal counsel. Victor Hargrove's land is still held. His name is on the building that Raymond works in. The federal plea agreement was finalized in early 2024. Margaret made no statement. She had already made the only statement that mattered in the way that mattered most to her. The documented, permanent, public record of what had actually happened. The record was complete. The work was done. There is one more thing I want to address before we get to what this story is actually about. And that is the question of what Margaret Cole felt during those 14 years. Because the story as it has been told, the strategy, the land acquisitions, the forensic accounting, the legal proceedings, can sound, if you are not careful, like the story of a woman who was entirely cold, entirely calculating, entirely organized around an outcome without remainder. That is not the truth, and I think it matters to say so. Sandra Osei, who was inside those years in a way that no one else was, has said that Margaret was angry, not performed anger, not the kind of anger that someone uses to justify what they are doing. Real anger, the kind that belongs to a person who had her professional life disrupted, her financial foundation stripped, her physical mobility permanently altered by an unrelated accident, and then was handed a folder by a man who had spent the preceding 9 months quietly stealing from her. Margaret was angry about what had been done to her. She remained angry about it for a long time. The anger did not drive the strategy. The strategy was too precise and too patient to be driven by anger, which is its own kind of discipline. But the anger was real, and it was present, and it was, in its way, appropriate. A person who is not angry about what was done to Margaret Cole has not been paying attention to what was done to Margaret Cole. The question was never whether the anger was real. The question was what she did with it. And what she did with it was refuse to let it make decisions for her. She put it somewhere that was not in charge. She built from a different part of herself. And 14 years later, when the outcome she had built toward was complete, Sandra said that what Margaret expressed was not triumph. It was not satisfaction in any simple sense. It was something closer to what Sandra called settled, a particular quality of having arrived at something that had always been true, and now, finally, was also the official record. The truth had been in the record all along. Now the record said so. That was what Margaret had been working toward. Not the money, not Raymond's bankruptcy, not the job offer, though that was its own particular kind of resolution. The record, the permanent, accurate, official, unalterable record of what had actually happened. For a woman who had spent her entire professional life understanding that the record is the thing that matters, that what is documented and provable and officially established is what endures, that record was the only outcome worth 14 years of building toward. She had it now, and she was settled. Here is what I want to leave you with. Not a moral, not an inspiration, not a lesson pressed into a neat shape that loses its edges. An honest observation about something true in this story that I think is worth carrying with you. Raymond Cole made many specific, documented, legally established mistakes. He was financially dishonest. He exploited the structural vulnerabilities of his marriage in ways that a federal court has confirmed crossed the line from aggressive to criminal. He left a woman who was disabled and had done nothing to deserve it, with resources he had deliberately minimized, and with a phone just out of reach. These are specific failures, and they deserve to be named specifically because they are specific. But underneath all of them, underneath the particular wrongdoing, There was one foundational error that made every other mistake possible, and every consequence inevitable. He looked at Margaret Hargrove Cole in a wheelchair with $47,000, and he decided she was finished. He decided that her circumstances were her limit. He decided that because she was leaving with less, she was going to remain with less. He decided this so thoroughly and so permanently that he never looked back. Not once in 14 years. He did not check. He did not assess. He did not consider the possibility that he was wrong. And that absence of consideration, that single foundational failure of imagination, was what undid everything else. Because when you decide someone is finished, you stop accounting for them. You stop tracking them as a variable in your life. You move them from the category of things that can affect your future into the category of things that already happened. And when you do that to a person who is not finished, who is in fact only beginning, you give them something that is worth more than money and more lasting than any legal settlement. You give them invisibility. And invisible people can go anywhere. They can acquire 43 parcels of land over a decade without triggering a single alarm in anyone's awareness. They can file a 211-page forensic accounting document, timed to arrive exactly when it will do exactly what it was built to do. They can be standing in the corridor you needed, holding the land you required, already in position before you finished deciding what you wanted to build. They can be there, already waiting, in the one place you never thought to check because you decided, 14 years ago, that they were no longer worth watching. There is a word for what sustained Margaret through those 14 years that I want to use carefully, because it is often softened into something smaller than what it actually is. People call it patience, and it was that. People call it strategy, and it was that too. People sometimes call what she did at the end, the job offer, grace. And I think there is something of grace in it, though it is the kind of grace that is also a verdict and a structure and a daily reminder simultaneously. But the thing that drove all of it, the thing that made 14 years of quiet, sustained, invisible building possible, was faith. A specific kind that does not look like what faith usually looks like on a poster or in a sermon. It was the faith of a woman sitting in a wheelchair on a Tuesday morning in April of 2009, with $47,000 and a folder of divorce papers and a phone just out of reach, who signed her name to a document she knew was unjust and thought, I know what I am capable of. I know what the truth is. I know what the record shows. And I am willing to wait as long as it takes for those things to matter. That is not passive. That is not resignation. That is the kind of internal stillness that is the rarest form of strength there is. And Raymond Cole, for all his ambition and his talent and all the things he built over 20 years, never developed it. He never needed to, he told himself. He was always moving, always reaching, always arriving somewhere. He did not discover, until it was too late to do anything useful with the knowledge, that standing still can be the most powerful position there is. Margaret discovered it at 34 years old in a hospital room with a prognosis she didn't ask for. She held on to that stillness for 14 years. She used it once, and it was enough. I want to ask you something before you go. I am not going to ask you to assess Raymond, because I think his situation has already assessed itself. I want to ask you about the moment Margaret signed those divorce papers. April 14, 2009. She knows the accounts have been drained. She knows the house is in an LLC. She has $47,000, and a phone that is just out of reach, and a man standing slightly to the left of the bedroom door, so the exit is clean. And she picks up the pen, and she signs, not because she has no choice, because she has decided this is not her moment, that her moment is coming, and that everything between now and then needs to be done correctly, or it will not work. How do you have that kind of clarity inside that much loss? How do you hold on to something that precise about who you are in the worst moment you have had? I want your answer. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. I genuinely want to know what you think about that moment. One more question before you close this out, because this is the one I find myself returning to. Raymond took the job. He shows up every day. He walks into a building that belongs to a company built entirely by the woman he left. He reports to a manager. He does the work that is assigned to him. He signs his name on documents inside an organization whose foundation is everything he dismissed as irrelevant. If you were Margaret, would you have made that same call? Would you have opened that door and let him in, kept him where you could see him, let him sit every day inside the understanding of what he threw away? Or would you have closed the door completely and never looked back? There is no wrong answer. The right answer depends entirely on what you believe justice is actually for. Drop it below. I want that conversation. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. Where in the world is this story landing? And if you have not yet subscribed at Tales by Teeplus, please do that now. Because the next story on this channel will be more interesting. That story is coming very soon. Make sure you are here for it. Take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next one.